Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called 3 Encounters with Praying Mantis Extraterrestrials. Praying mantis is probably one of the most common types of ETs that people report to me. I've covered a couple of other cases in some of my previous videos, but the 3 cases that I'd like to cover today are all brand new. And the first case I call Case 1, They Come From Afar. The main witness is a Southern California woman by the name of Jeannie. She did allow me to use her real name, but I'm only going to use her first name here. And she had an amazing series of incidents, actually, which led her to the realization that she was in touch with praying mantis extraterrestrials. And the first incident occurred in 1998. She and her husband, now her ex-husband, had gone out to dinner, and they returned home, watched some TV, and then went to bed. And at around 2 a.m., Jeannie woke up for a very strange reason. As she says, "I was awakened because I had this horrific taste of garlic in my mouth. It was as if I had eaten a complete head of garlic, the whole thing, raw. That's how strong it was. Well, if you can imagine, it woke me up, so I thought, what in the heck is this?" Jeannie had no explanation. She hadn't even eaten garlic that evening. She woke up, looked at her husband. He was sound asleep. She went to the bathroom, checked her mouth in the mirror. There was nothing strange. She gargled, she brushed her teeth, but nothing could get rid of this garlicky smell. And she ended up just going back to bed and falling asleep. But this is how it all started. This is when she really started to question what was going on in her life. This was not the first time that strange incidents had occurred to her. And now, looking back on her life, she could count dozens of other weird incidents that she would call unexplained. And many of these involved weird nighttime incidents during which strange figures would visit her and give messages to her while she was sort of in a half-sleep, half-waking state. And whenever this occurred, she would write them down in a little diary that she kept, but she didn't know quite what to make of them. She did not associate this with ETs. Despite this, she was developing a strong interest in UFOs. She had had a lot of dreams about UFOs, started reading books about UFOs, and pretty soon had a pretty good library of UFO books. But she never connected the dots until the year 2000. At that time, she was reading the newspaper and saw that there was a little UFO group near where she lived, and they were hosting a speaker, a UFO investigator by the name of Daryl Sims. Daryl Sims is, of course, a pretty prominent UFO investigator, and Jeannie decided that she would attend the meeting just because she was interested in the subject of UFOs. She did not think she was involved. She enjoyed the meeting very much. Daryl Sims had a very interesting presentation. And afterwards, she approached him and told him about her experience with waking up and tasting this strong taste of garlic in her mouth. Daryl seemed to be very interested in this. He told her he thought that it was a screen memory, and he offered to hypnotize her. Jeannie was a little nervous about it at first, but she agreed. And Daryl came to her apartment and conducted a hypnosis session. And at first, Jeannie didn't recall anything. She went into a hypnotic trance pretty easily, but seemed to be blocked. And it wasn't until the very end of the session that something did happen. She did recall something very profound that was related to that evening when she woke up tasting garlic in her mouth. As she says, and I quote, "Towards the end of that session, I could see myself standing between the bathroom and my bed, and I saw what looked like an ant creature, like a praying mantis. I'm not sure. I saw mostly its head and its face, but I saw this creature shoving something down my throat. I don't know if it was a tube or what it was. I know I was fighting it. It was big, a lot bigger than me. It scared the daylights out of me when I saw it there. In that flash, I was terrified. I was trying to fight off this thing because it was shoving something down my throat. Like I said, I couldn't tell if it was a tube or if it was trying to inject something down my throat or what it was. But I could see and feel that thing going down my throat, and this creature was holding me down, so it could do this. I just felt a force holding me down so that I couldn't fight it, although I was trying. It was a brief flashback, but it really quite traumatized her, and Daryl Sims was very much convinced that this was a memory of an actual encounter. Jeannie was, of course, shocked. She wondered how could something like this have happened to her, and how long had this been going on. And her first step was, of course, to examine her entire life and look for any weird happenings that might be related to this event. And she didn't have to look very deeply. There were lots of clues that something had been going on in her life for a very long time. One early incident that immediately stood out occurred when she was about 8 years old. Her parents had sent her to a 6-week-long camp for girls in the Hollywood Hills in California, her and her sister. And there was all kinds of fun activities for the preteens, but Jeannie didn't really want to go there. She wanted to stay at home with her friends. And one of the reasons was because she did not like sleeping outside. She had a very deep-seated fear of sleeping outside, and also a fear of coyotes, although she had no idea where this fear came from. Thankfully, there were little bungalows for the girls to sleep in. However, many times people would want to sleep outside next to the campfire. And this, of course, made Jeannie very concerned, and she always chose to sleep inside. But then one evening came where everybody, all the girls, decided that they were going to sleep out under the stars. And one by one, all the girls left the bungalow except Jeannie and her little sister, who refused. They wanted to sleep inside. And that's what they did. Jeannie was in the top bunk next to the window, and her sister was in a lower bunk. And sometime in the middle of the night, Jeannie was woken up by a weird disturbance. It began without any warning. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light filling the room, accompanied by a strong rush of wind. And it was quite traumatic. Jeannie thought at first that she had actually been struck by lightning. And she didn't bother to stop and investigate. She leapt out of bed and, along with her little sister, ran outside screaming and ran to the camp. All the other girls were already asleep. It was just a few 100 feet away. At this point, Jeannie's memory becomes a little bit confused. She remembers finding a spot and climbing into a sleeping bag. And then she remembers something that really scared her. She remembers waking up and seeing several very large coyotes surrounding her and glaring at her with these very cold, staring eyes. And her memory ends at this point. She didn't know how to explain this incident. She just knew that she was afraid of sleeping outside. And now that she knew about this other encounter with the praying mantis, she wondered if this might be connected. And she contacted Daryl Sims, who agreed to do another hypnosis session. And he arrived at her apartment. She sat down in her easy chair while Daryl Sims placed her under hypnosis. And she was surprised how well it worked. She could vividly remember going back to this incident, reliving the whole scene as if she was really there. And as she got closer and closer to this moment of this, quote, lightning strike, she began to get very, very anxious. She started to shout out, "I need to get out of here! I need to get out of here!" Daryl had done hypnosis before. He knew how to calm her down, which he did. And he continued the hypnosis session, bringing her closer and closer to this moment. And suddenly she was there, and she saw the cause of her fear. It wasn't lightning at all. And as she was laying there in her bunk bed, she woke up to see the room filling with a bright, blazing light. And seconds later, 2 extraterrestrials began to come in through the closed window. As Jeannie says, "I saw 4 arms coming through the window. They were long, skinny arms with something like 3 or 4 fingers at the end of them and a real bright light behind them. I ran out of the room." Jeannie continued the hypnosis session, and she was very resistant at first, but Daryl Sims was very persistent and led her to the next incident that she remembered, where she was being surrounded by coyotes. And as she came upon that memory, that's exactly what she saw. The only difference was the coyotes' appearance. They were much larger than she remembered, and all of them were staring at her with eyes that glowed a bright, brilliant, glaring blue color. And that's all she could remember. And Daryl told her that the coyotes were probably another screen memory, but it was clear to her that he was probably right. These were definitely not normal coyotes. But she ended the hypnosis sessions at this point because it was just too frightening for her. And taken alone, I think this would just be one piece of the puzzle that she couldn't make sense of, but there were quite a few other strange incidents that she recalled. One thing that she recalled was having lots and lots of UFO dreams, pretty much her whole life. As Jeannie says, "All through my childhood and into my adulthood, I would have the same dream over and over again. And as I grew older, I was always age appropriate in the dream. And the dream was, I was in a park. It was nighttime, and there were lots of people around. All of a sudden, the night sky filled with all kinds of saucers or flying machines. They were filling the sky, and everybody was panicked and running. So because they were running, I was running. And all of these people were scared to death, but I was never afraid. I've had this same dream over and over." And this was not Jeannie's only ET-themed dream. She had many other dreams about UFOs. As she says, "I had a dream where I was fixing a meal, and I was excited because I knew that, quote, the visitors were coming. And I was getting ready to welcome them. Then shortly after that, I had another dream that there was a mothership hovering over my apartment. More recently, I've had dreams where I was sitting in a park at nighttime. I was sitting in the grass with a person, and then all of a sudden, out of the sky, these UFOs were coming straight at me in a V formation. They were all identical. And I said to the person sitting next to me, 'See, I told you they were real. I told you.' Another repetitive dream she wrote down in her diary, she called it the Star People. As she says, 'In this dream, I was in a city like New York, walking on the sidewalk in a crowd of people, and out of the crowd, a young man holding a big stack of newspapers came up to me. He found me out of the crowd, handed me one of the papers, and then disappeared. And I looked down at the headline of the paper. In big, huge black letters, it said Star People. And that was the dream.'" Jeannie, in the past, had always looked at these dreams as just a reflection of her interest in UFOs, and now she began to wonder if it might be the reverse, that maybe these dreams were reflections of actual contact. And the more she thought about it, the more this seemed like the case. because she was having other very strange experiences with these nighttime entities coming into her bedroom. One time Jeannie was laying in bed, kind of dozing, when she had the distinct impression that a gray alien or something was standing in the doorway. As she says, I felt that there was a gray peeking into our bedroom, and as soon as I opened my eyes, it was gone. Then a while later, I felt that there were two of them standing at the foot of my bed. With these two at the foot of my bed, it was like we were talking telepathically, and they knew that I wanted to know what was going on, what the truth of all of this was. And I could hear them talking with each other, wondering what they were going to do with me because I wanted to know so badly. Those were the words I heard. Then I opened my eyes, and they weren't there. This was all before she had gone to meet Daryl Sims, but now, having gone under hypnosis and recalled these incidents, she started to really connect the dots and realized that she was probably in having contact with extraterrestrials on some level. One incident really convinced her that it was related to all of this. For a period of about a month, Jeannie found that she was unable to sleep peacefully at night. Normally she had no trouble sleeping, but for a month she would just toss and turn and felt like she was constantly on guard and then something was trying to get her. As she says, I'd fall asleep and find myself kicking and fighting, and I never do this. This is very unusual behavior for me. This lasted about a month, and then one night, I was kicking so hard all the covers were at the end of my bed. This actually happened. Towards the end of the night, in a flash, while I was kicking and fighting, I saw myself in an examination room, and I saw one of these creatures standing at the foot of this table, and it was huge. It looked like a mantis, or some kind of animal-looking thing. It must have been 7 feet tall, and it was leaning over me, and there was another in the background. It was either shorter than this one or possibly as tall, but because it was standing further back, I couldn't tell the size of it. And that was just in a flash, in an instant. I saw that scene and I thought, well, this must be what I have been fighting. Following that evening, she began to sleep peacefully again. She reverted back to her normal sleeping habits. But again, she connected all of this together and realized that she was in contact with ETs. And it was shortly later that she underwent hypnotic regression with Daryl Sims and confirmed this. Following this, she became very active in the UFO field. She actually led a UFO group for a short time, which she gave up eventually because it was just too much work. But she continued to have experiences. Often these, what she perceives to be grays, would come into her room when she was in a quasi-sleeping, quasi-awake state, and they would give her messages. And she would always write them down. One phrase, one message that she wrote down was very short. It said, and I quote, "We are trying to communicate with you, but you don't understand." Other messages were more profound. One time she woke up and wrote down the very provocative message, "Those that come from afar will show you the way." Interestingly, while Jeannie does have a lot of the markers pointing towards being a UFO abductee, she has never seen a UFO, nor does she have any unexplained scars or scoop marks on her body, which are typical of many UFO contactees. But she did notice a few other symptoms. On several occasions, she woke up to find that her navel, her belly button, was red, sore, and inflamed. That always puzzled her, but she now links it to her UFO experiences. Probably the most inexplicable physical symptom that she had was fluorescence on her body. After reading about this weird effect that some contactees report that their bodies will fluoresce under a black light, she decided she would check herself with the black light and see if there was any evidence there, and to her surprise, there was. And she found that under a black light, the palms of her hands glowed with a bright fluorescence. Her friend was there. Her friend didn't have any of this. Jeannie went and washed her hands vigorously, but still they glowed under a black light and glowed for the next several days before finally fading away. So while some of Jeannie's encounters have been somewhat traumatic, she has dealt with them as best as she can. One thing that she says unnerves her is seeing other people's drawings of praying mantis ETs. They look very familiar to her, and as she says, when people start showing me pictures of different ETs, there are some that I can't look at. I get goosebumps all over, and it makes me want to throw up. Some of them make me cringe. I can't look at them. The next case I'd like to talk about, I call Case 2, the Giant Grasshopper Dream. This is a very interesting case. It occurred to a man I call Tom. That's a pseudonym. And this case shows how people can have ET contact and not be aware of it for a very long time. For Tom, it all began with a dream. The first time he had this dream, Tom had no reason to think much of it other than it was an extremely vivid and terrifying dream. In this dream, he says, I am being chased around my grandparents' farmhouse by a giant grasshopper. He wasn't hurt in the dream, but every time he dreams this, the fear of the dream wakes him up. At the time, he was just a kid, around 10 or 11. But along with this dream came a dread phobia of grasshoppers. And the dream would repeat over and over again, all through childhood up into adulthood. Interestingly, it was about the time that he started having this repetitive dream that there was another strange incident. Tom and his family had gone to visit his grandparents' farm. Tom doesn't remember anything unusual happening at the farm itself. However, when they arrived home after the visit, everybody was puzzled about one strange mystery. It was 1 hour later than it should have been. They had missing time driving home. None of them have ever heard of such a thing. They didn't know what to make of it, and unable to explain it, nobody made much of it and didn't know what to think of it. Meanwhile, Tom continued to have his very terrifying grasshopper nightmare. It was always the same, and it continued right up through adulthood, and his dread fear of grasshoppers also persisted. Time marched on. He ended up going to college. He earned a master's degree in education and another in psychology. He moved to Florida, where he became a college professor. And it was around this time that he began to connect the dots. He became interested in UFOs, and he noticed a couple of strange things that seemed to be related to the UFO phenomenon. As Tom says, and I quote, I have scoop marks. I have chronic sinusitis. I have 3 dots in a triangle pattern on my throat. A doctor looking at an MRI of my sinuses said it appeared that I had broken my nose, though I am unaware of any such injury. In 1983, he had 2 UFO sightings, and this is when he really began to research UFOs. He joined APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. His interest in UFOs continued to grow to the point where he actually wrote a small UFO newsletter. And meanwhile, his terrifying dream about being chased by a grasshopper continued. By this point, he was pretty sure what this repetitive dream meant. Not only the dream, but all the other signs. He figured it out. He connected the dots and realized there was a pretty good possibility that he was an experiencer, a UFO abductee. And he considered regressive hypnosis, but wasn't quite ready to pursue it. He still felt a little bit ambivalent about all of this and wasn't entirely sure that he was, just jumping to conclusions. All he had were small clues pointing towards the possibility that he was an experiencer. He didn't have any real proof. But then came another strange incident. One day Tom was talking with his younger brother, who related a strange memory involving Tom that took place at their grandparents' farm. As Tom says, my brother recalled seeing me outside at my grandparents' farm covered in grasshoppers. His brother recalled seeing him covered from head to toe in grasshoppers all over his body. That really raised alarm bells in Tom's mind, and he felt like it's probably related to his own dream of being chased around by a giant grasshopper. And some years later, Tom asked his brother again about the dream, and his brother had no memory of it. He denied ever saying this to Tom. This is another clue. As you may know, there are often memory problems associated with UFO encounters. And now here was Tom's brother denying that he had ever had this dream. But Tom's sure because it left a very deep and vivid impression on him. So it was this clue that pretty much convinced Tom that he was in fact having or had an encounter with a giant grasshopper-like extraterrestrial. And he's still considering hypnosis. He hasn't done it yet, but he knows enough about UFOs to have put all the pieces together. The dreams, the marks on his body, the missing time, his sinus problems, his brother's dream, all of this comes together, and he's pretty sure that he's probably a contactee. And for now, that's enough for him. And as of yet, he does not recall anything else. So the third encounter I'd like to talk about is, I think, the most interesting one. I call this Case 3, It Walked Upright. This involves a lady by the name of Eleanor. That's not her real name. And this is a very interesting account. At 4:30 a.m. in mid-November of 2006, Eleanor began to get ready for her morning jog. She lived in a very rural area of O'Fallon, Illinois. This is a small neighborhood subdivision intermingled with cornfields and swaths of forest. It's a very pretty location with lots of greenery. Less than 10 miles to the southeast is Scott Air Force Base. This might be significant. Eleanor herself is a school teacher and a daycare worker. At the time of this incident, she was in her mid-30s. She has 5 children. And to keep fit, she would regularly take early morning jogs along with her dog through her neighborhood. On this particular morning, events began as normal. She got up at around 4:30 a.m. and with her dog started jogging down the street. She turned off her street onto another street, and then she turned onto a little road called Eleanor Drive and began to head north. She was just passing Fulton Junior High School on her left. On her right was a cornfield, and Eleanor Drive ended in a T-section just ahead of her onto Kyle Road. She was about 200 feet approximately from the T intersection, which was illuminated by a streetlight. And this is when something very strange happened. And I'll just let Eleanor describe it in her own words. As Eleanor says, "Suddenly, my dog became alert. She slowed her pace, lifted her head and ears, and locked her sight onto something ahead. I casually looked up, expecting to see an animal. It was normal to come across deer, coyote, foxes, or occasionally other pedestrians. In the road ahead was something I couldn't make sense of. I slowly came to a stop as I tried to figure out what I was looking at. It was walking adjacent to the streetlight. It was almost as tall as the streetlight and moving to the right. It was very dark gray and walked upright. My first thought was that someone was in costume doing some kind of acrobatics on stilts with extenders on their arms. As I watched, I could tell that it moved with ease and intention, and that no one could make stilts bend at the knees and elbows. It was long, thin, and had what looked like points for hands. I was thinking grasshopper at first, because of the jointed legs and the tips of the appendages, and it appeared to have a kind of an exoskeleton. The creature was very dark gray, not quite black, and it seemed to be all one color. I decided later that it was more praying mantis-like. Its incredibly long legs were taking massive strides as its arms were held up forward and bent at the elbows, with the forearms and hands moving up and down in a pumping motion. The profile of the head seemed almost rectangular, but wider at the top and narrowing where it connected to the body. And as its gaze swept from side to side, almost like it was looking for something on the ground. Each stride was approximately 6 or 7 feet. It covered a lot of ground in only a few steps. It seemed unhurried and focused. It did not seem to be worried about being spotted. I did not see any clothing. It looked exactly like an upright, walking, praying mantis, with more insect quality to it than human. So I stopped where I was and watched what I was seeing. It was just walking down the road, and I realized it was a real and solid creature, living. As it walked, its legs lifted up and would reach and stretch in very long strides. It was long, dark, and skinny, and as it was striding, its arms were moving in a pumping motion above its head. Eleanor had never seen anything like this. She'd never seen a UFO before. Aliens were the farthest thing from her mind, and now seeing this figure, she really struggled to orient herself. As she says, "My mind was whirling with trying to decide what to do. I really thought about turning back and racing for home, but for some reason I was more compelled to get a closer look. It had not seemed to be aware of me and was continuing its movement down the road, heading closer to the wooded and darkened section. I slowly started running forward, and I never took my eyes off the creature. My dog was very alert and also watching, but she did not pull on the leash or bark. By the time I got to the corner, it moved far enough into the darkness and I could no longer see it. I knew better than to follow it into the darkness, and I turned left onto my normal route. I kept my eyes wide open for the rest of my run and every run after that. I've never seen it again." This encounter, of course, unnerved her and left her with all kinds of questions. It actually completely changed her worldview. She had no idea that things like this existed. As she says, "I went back to that area later in the day during daylight, and I stood under the streetlight. I am 5 foot 5 inches, and the streetlight was at least 3 times my height. So I know that the being was close to 15 feet tall. I have never given much thought to aliens until this time, and it has still taken me years to conclude that it was likely some kind of interdimensional being. I compulsively wonder why I saw this. Why would it let me see it? Was it a mistake? What am I supposed to do about it? Sometimes I wish I never saw it, but at the same time, I now have an awareness that there is something more. She did tell her family, her husband and her children, who were very supportive. They didn't know what to make of it, neither did she. She began doing research and did run across a similar account of a gentleman who also saw a praying mantis about 40 miles away crossing the road late at night. In his case, he saw a praying mantis that was on all fours crossing the road, so he doesn't know how tall it was. Another interesting factor to this particular account is that it occurred in the year 2006, only a short time after the very famous Chicago O'Hare airport sighting. So this really made her wonder. Chicago O'Hare Airport was only about 300 miles away from her location, which, as the UFO flies, is not very far away. She wondered if possibly there was a connection there. Another thing that concerned her was that this incident occurred so close to Scott Air Force Base. I was also intrigued by this fact, and I immediately thought of the sighting that occurred 6 years earlier when a group of police officers across the state of Illinois in this exact area tracked a triangular-shaped UFO, which actually went right along the outskirts of Scott Air Force Base, directly between Scott Air Force Base and O'Fallon, Illinois, where Eleanor lived at this time. So there does seem to be other activity in this area, but Eleanor does not know if there is a connection to Scott Air Force Base. But as I spoke with her, I thought perhaps this was a one-off, a singular event, but that's not usually the case when someone sees ETs close up. This is often an indicator that they've probably had other encounters, often which start in very early childhood. And I asked Eleanor, had she had any strange experiences in her childhood? And she said that yes, in fact, she had. She remembered seeing strange hooded figures, come into her room when she was just a little girl. This would always occur late at night or early morning. She would scream, call for her parents, who would come running in, and of course nothing would be there. It happened often enough that her parents forbade her from waking them up any further. So she was kind of on her own with this. And she did have one really vivid memory, which she recalled as a nightmare, in which she wasn't in her room at all. She was in what appeared to be a UFO, presumably. As Eleanor says, and I quote, "In this nightmare, I awoke on a metal bed with a sheet pulled over my face. I could hear what I thought were doctors discussing a very serious medical procedure. I could see shadowy figures moving around through the sheet, but I could not move. I felt nervous, but was wondering who was getting an operation and what might be going on. As I lay there, someone began to lift the sheet off of me. There were doctors standing around my body with trays of metallic surgical tools. The doctors seemed to be wearing something like surgical gowns. I could not see their faces. I was fully engulfed in the deepest terror, knowing that they were going to fix me. I don't know what happened next. I woke up, and it was morning." Following this, Eleanor did start having some anxieties and night terrors, which slowly faded away and ended. But this was not her last unusual experience. There was one incident that occurred in 1986 when she was a senior in high school. At the time, she lived in Elk Grove, California. And one morning, she was going to school to attend a field trip. A friend was driving. Eleanor was in the front passenger seat, and a young preschool-aged child sat in the back seat. And Eleanor was looking out of the passenger window when she heard the child sitting behind her gasp loudly. At that exact moment, a car was pulling up next to them, and Eleanor looked at the driver, and she also gasped because the driver did not appear to be human. As Eleanor says, I was pretty shocked to see the profile of an elongated, oval-shaped head. It was smooth, with minimal profile features. The color was extremely pale and had a corpse-like look to it. There were just a few spriggles of hair coming from its head. As suddenly as I could take this in, the head slowly turned and made eye contact with me. The eyes were dark, sunken pools of black. I jerked my head away and said nothing. This shook Eleanor up pretty badly. It was clear that this figure, whatever it was not human, and she didn't know what to make of it. She didn't think E.T. at the time, but now she wonders if perhaps this was some sort of strange hybrid. And other strange experiences followed. She grew up, she became an adult. She moved to O'Fallon, Illinois, and in 2006 had that strange praying mantis encounter. But it was about 5 years later, she was out jogging in 2011 when she had another strange encounter. She was again jogging with her dog, a different dog, and went up Eleni Drive, turned left onto Kyle Road, and had just turned left. There's a massive water tower being constructed on her right. And again, it was her dog who noticed something strange first. Her dog suddenly became very excited about something up ahead, and she assumed that it was going to be an animal or another person. And about 25 feet ahead of her, she saw something crawling across the road. And it was this weird, foggy-looking kind of thing. She knows it wasn't normal fog because it was very concentrated. As she says, and I quote, "This was a concentrated ball of illuminated mist. It was distinctly round and compacted and seemed to be illuminated somehow. It was about 3 feet tall and had tendrils of mist that looked like octopus legs rotating up and over from behind the ball and moving itself forward in a rolling motion. My dog was excitedly pulling me forward, and even though it was insanely weird, I did not feel scared about it and hurried to get closer. And as it moved up to the grassy area of the schoolyard, it began to slowly fade and vanished by the time I got close." It was 1 year later, in 2012, that Eleanor had her first UFO sighting. Looking at her backyard, she saw a large golden-colored orb hovering over her neighbor's house. She quickly called out her daughter, who also saw it, and it hovered there for quite some time before finally moving away. And she continued to have encounters. It was 2 years later, in 2014, she had a very strange encounter while visiting the Sam's Club department store. She was actually in line, and looking ahead of her in line, she was surprised to see a very strange-looking figure. She appeared to be female. As Eleanor says, her head was oblong, pale, and mottled with veins. She had a few spriggles of hair. I wasn't really thinking, but as she slowly turned around, she made eye contact with me, and she had dark pools of blackness for eyes. I jerked my head away as I felt ashamed for inadvertently staring. The store doors opened, and I looked back just a moment after the eye contact, and she wasn't there. It seemed that she had vanished. What was really strange is not only the appearance of this being, but how quickly it disappeared. It seemed to disappear much more quickly than just walking away. Eleanor does not know what to make of this sighting, and again wonders if this could perhaps have been a hybrid ET that was showing itself to her on purpose. She doesn't know. But it was shortly after that she moved out of O'Fallon, Illinois, and that was her last really unexplained experience. But there was one weird thing that did happen. Shortly before moving out of this home in O'Fallon, she and her husband had invited a couple over. And the husband of this couple was a retired Air Force officer who had actually worked at the nearby Scott Air Force Base. And normally Eleanor does not talk to anyone about her 2006 sighting of a praying mantis ET, but for some reason she found herself telling this guy, a colonel, the whole story. And after telling the story, the Air Force officer seemed to be very awkward and uncomfortable. As Eleanor says, they sat in quiet silence as I regretted my mistake. When I finished, they were quiet. After a few moments, he told me he didn't believe in that kind of stuff. Seemingly hesitant, he proceeded to tell me that he had worked with a guy at Scott that lived somewhere along Kyle Road, who told him that weird things happen over on Kyle Road. I know he didn't mean weird stuff like cops and robbers sort of things, by the way he said it. I asked if he could tell me exactly what, and he said no. And that was the last of that. So Eleanor is ultimately happy that she's had these weird experiences. She feels that they've enriched her life and enlightened her to what is truly out there. But it was her encounter with a 15-foot tall praying mantis that impressed her the most. That was actually why she contacted me, because she had read another encounter involving a praying mantis in one of my books. And in that encounter, the praying mantis was also 15 foot tall. I would call this an outlier. Most of the praying mantis type cases are usually, they're 8, maybe 9 feet tall. But in her case, she's insistent. She's absolutely sure that this figure was 15 feet tall. As she says, it was a 15-foot tall praying mantis man striding down the street early one morning while I was out for my run. It has definitely changed my life and my perception about what exists here and in other places. So that's it. Those are the 3 praying mantis ET encounters that I wanted to share with you. I covered Jeannie Noble's case in my book, Inside UFOs. The other case involving Tom and the strange grasshopper dream, and Eleanor's case with the 15-foot tall praying mantis are both in my new book, Wondrous, 25 True UFO Encounters. So you can read more about what happened in that book. But yeah, these cases show that there does appear to be praying mantis ETs visiting our planet. And again, this would be probably among the most common, certainly, next to greys and human-looking ETs, of the type of ET that people tell me about. It's not unusual. And Eleanor's description matches perfectly what I've heard from other people, as well as, for that matter, Tom's description and Jeannie's. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I really appreciate you watching. Thank you very much, and until next time, keep having fun.